Imagine a once great civilization with mighty kings and towering palaces reduced to ruins. The people, now desperate, take to the seas in search of a new home. This was the fate of many Greeks in the 12th century BC after the collapse of the Mycenaean world. Faced with famine, invasions, and disasters, they became wanderers known to history as the Sea People. These displaced Greeks joined forces with other groups raiding and attacking the coast of the Mediterranean. Eventually, some of them known as the Philistines settled on the shores of Canaan, founding cities that would become infamous in biblical history. In this story of migration and survival, we see the collapse of one world and the birth of a new one, a journey that shaped the history of Greece, the Levant, and the entire Mediterranean. I'm Dr. David Santos. We're continuing our study in ancient Mediterranean history, the birth of the new Greece, 1100 BC to 700 BC. I want to continue on just reading through the story of the fall of the Mycenaeans, and then we'll come back and we'll fit them within their historical narrative. So the tale I just told you has this great combination of historical drama, migration, and cultural transformation, and it really helps to connect the fall of the Mycenaean Greece to the rise of the new powers of the ancient world. So yes, this is a compelling story. It's a story about the collapse of the Mycenaean Greece and the later migration that could be tied to the Sea Peoples. So I am putting a little bit of a dramatic flair to this story, but we do have some ancient accounts and archaeological evidence that provides for powerful and dramatic context for understanding why certain Greeks might have left their homeland and become part of these mysterious Sea Peoples. So it's around 1200 BC, the once great Mycenaean civilization, which had dominated mainland Greece, began to crumble. The Mycenaeans were known for their impressive palaces, such as those at Mycenae and Pylos, and their roles in inspiring the legends of the Trojan War. They were a seafaring people, skilled in trade and warfare. By the end of the 13th century BC, their world was on the verge of collapse. The exact reason for the downfall of Mycenaean Greece, it's still debated. Some suggest natural disasters like earthquakes or droughts, while others point to internal strife, the possibility of invasion by outside groups. It's in this period of turmoil and chaos that many scholars believe a portion of the Mycenaeans may have fled their homeland, taken the seas in search for new territories. We call it the Exodus from Greece. As their once great cities fell into ruin and their society collapsed, some Mycenaeans facing starvation, instability, and attacks from invaders decided to abandon their land. Taking to their ships, they joined other displaced peoples from the Aegean and Mediterranean, and they form a coalition later known as the Sea Peoples. So these Greeks, once proud rulers of palatial kingdoms, transformed into a marauding sea raiders. Sailing the Mediterranean, they attacked and plundered coastal cities and civilizations that were equally weakened by the turmoil of the late Bronze. They moved south, striking Egypt and the Levantine coast, creating fear and chaos wherever they landed. In Egypt, we have records where these raiders were called the Peleset, and there are other names that hint at their diverse origins. So the journey is a complex one. After a failed attempt to invade Egypt during the reign of Ramses III in 1100 BC, the Sea Peoples, including groups later known as the Philistines, migrated and settled in the coastal regions of Canaan. It was here that they established a new life, founding cities like Gaza, Ashkelon, and Ashdod. The Philistines, who were often connected to Mycenaean and Aegean culture through their pottery, architecture, and weapons, represent a remnant of those once great Greek kingdoms, now displaced and transformed by their desperate circumstances. The story of their journey from Greece to the shores of the Levant mirrors a broader collapse of the Bronze Age civilization. As their cities fell and the lands became uninhabitable, they became wanderers, forced to seek survival through conquest and migration. So for our lecture today, we can just recognize that this story offers a dramatic introduction to the time period we're talking about, and how powerful civilizations like the Mycenaeans can descend into chaos, pushing its people to become the feared sea people. So that's the Mycenaeans, and we know their time frame here. We're looking at beginning around 1100 BC. Before we jump into them, we are going to take a brief look at who came before them. And that group is called the Minoans. They're 2600 to 1400 BC. In order to integrate them into our study, we need to consider its significance before the Mycenaean civilization and how it influenced the later developments in Greece. The Minoan civilization centered on the island of Crete. There's amazing archaeology there. Much of it is online. You can find these things. You can even get on Google Earth and drill down over the top of many of their sites and see the layout of the sites and the cities and where the palaces were. So a lot of information there to be had. So, and it's considered one of the earliest advanced civilizations in Europe. So the Minoan culture and its influence. So the Minoans are known for their impressive palaces like that of Knossos, advanced architecture, vibrant frescoes full of color, and you can see the palace at Knossos right on your left. Amazing picture, amazing colors. So the society was highly sophisticated with a complex economy based on trade with Egypt, Mesopotamia, and other Mediterranean regions. They developed a writing system called Linear A, and though it's not been fully deciphered yet. So if you're looking to get your PhD, you can decipher Linear A and get it post-haste, I'm sure. So decline of Minoans is around 1450 BC. The Minoan civilization experienced a sudden decline. Like we've already said, natural disasters are a possibility, and invasion could be part of it, and possibly by the Mycenaeans from the Greek mainland. So after the decline, the Mycenaeans absorbed many elements of the Minoans, which include art, architecture, and religious practices. The Mycenaeans adopted the Minoan script Linear A to create their own form of writing, Linear B, which is an earlier form of Greek. Linear B has been somewhat translated. The Minoan religious practices, particularly those involving worship of a mother goddess, influenced the Mycenaean pantheon and continue into later Greek religious traditions. Now, I would just point out that this mother goddess tradition that we see in the Minoan culture, passed on to the Mycenaeans, very similar to that which we see in Mesopotamia and that which we see all around the Mediterranean societies that come about. So they're known for craftsmanship, and just much of what they had done gets maintained in the cultural memory of the Mycenaeans. So they had an influence after the collapse of both the Minoan and the Mycenaean civilizations. A lot of the knowledge and artistry from the cultures was lost during the Dark Ages. But fortunately, remnants of their achievements, such as pottery designs, religious iconography, and mythology, those get preserved and maintained through this cultural memory, passed on, and have a revival later. The memory of the Minoan and Mycenaean achievements survived in Greek mythology, with figures like King Minos, the Labyrinth, and the Minotaur becoming part of the epic stories that shaped Greek identity. So it's interesting that this story here, King Minos, in the Labyrinth, and the Minotaur, all make its way into culture. And what you'll see within these cultures, in their iconography, you'll see bulls in a lot of what they do. And these bulls, oftentimes someone will be jumping over them, and many people have suggested connections with the stories back to King Minos and Minotaurs and such. Matter of fact, the temple I showed you earlier, there are what appear to be what were underground labyrinths there. For some reason, they have them. So interesting to observe the archaeology and understand the mythology at the same time. So just to conclude this section, the Minoan civilization played a crucial role in laying the cultural and economic foundations for the Mycenaean civilization, which in turn influenced later Greek Dark Ages and Archaic period. The transition from the Minoans to the Mycenaeans and eventually to the rise of the Greek city-states, which we'll talk about next week, represents a continuity of cultural memory and innovation. So the Greek Dark Ages. It's the fall of the Mycenaean civilization around 1100 BC. So we've gone from first Minoans to Mycenaeans. Minoans fall. Mycenaeans take their place, and they fall about 1100. So again, the reason for this collapse is debated, but considering invasion, internal strife, natural disasters, could be a lot of different reasons. And it's interesting that this is something that happens regionally there. So the Mycenaeans were the dominant power in Greece during the late Bronze Age, and they're famous for their palaces and connection to events in Homer's epic, the Iliad and the Odyssey. So for a long time, the Iliad and the Odyssey were considered just mythology. So we're going to do a deep dive into them at a later date. But for those of you that are not aware of what these are the epic poems, mainly attributed to Homer, who we'll meet in a minute. And the Iliad is about a group of Greeks who travel to the Greek city of Troy. In the Greek city of Troy, they are under siege because they stole or kidnapped Helen. So they've gone to rescue Helen from the city of Troy. The Iliad is a story about one of the main characters in the Odyssey is about one of the main characters from the Iliad trying to make his way home. And it's another epic poem. And if you're unaware of these, I do recommend finding a kid's version for first introduction, and possibly even go to YouTube and you can find the Wishbone episode, about 25 minutes. You got the whole story figured out, except they always include the account of the Trojan horse, and that's how the Greeks take over the city of Troy. Doesn't appear in the epic poem of the Iliad. It's actually in an alternate document called the Little Iliad. So if you're looking for that and you're reading through it or you're watching a show and you're waiting for the end, it ain't coming. So just be prepared, unless it does appear in the Wishbones. So if you're familiar with that one, go ahead and grab it and watch it with your kids or your nephews, whoever might like it. So the Greek Dark Ages, about 1100 to 800, this period saw a sharp decline in population. It also is characterized by limited literacy, which also tells you previous eras had higher levels of literacy. So they have less economic activity, so less trading around the big pond. Greece reverted to a simpler, more rural existence. So they've simplified, they have fewer resources. They're not building these monumental structures and doing less and less trade around the Mediterranean. It's during the Dark Ages where we see the use of linear B writing disappear. Now, good thing, bad thing, what comes out of that later is the appearance of a new Greek alphabet, and it emerges in the 8th century BC, and it's inspired by the Phoenician alphabet, so it makes language and writing simpler than what they had before. We also see the Dorian invasion. So the Dorians were a group of people who are believed to have migrated into Greece. They may have had some of the same problems that we see the Mycenaeans having, which is why they would be moving. They're looking for a new place with more resources. So they settled in regions such as Sparta, Corinth, Crete, and they're influencers of the social and political structures of these areas, especially as they come later. Well, we're not done with the Dorians. We'll see the Dorians again in coming lectures. So the rise of the polis, which is a way of just an introduction to this time period we're talking about. We'll mention these, but the next lecture is dedicated to the rise of the polis. So the development of the polis, or city-state, began to take shape towards the end of the Dark Ages, around 800. So key city-states that emerged during this time include Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and Thebes, among others. And the polis became the defining political unit of ancient Greece, with each one developing its own government, military, and culture. So just they're interesting. The Greeks are going to eventually be unified to some degree, but for quite some time they're going to maintain city-state identities. But they're also going to recognize we are all Greeks. So at times we're going to see them unified, such as unification, somewhat unified during the Persian War. They're not completely unified. They have different ideas about what it means to be Greek, but they have almost a universal philosophical idea of what Greekness means. We'll see that especially show up in Athens. So the Athenians have this idea of what it means to be Greek, but they also do battle against each other. We're going to see that in the Peloponnesian Wars and see what forces led them to dislike one another. But that's what happens. But they do eventually have this idea that is partly unifying, at least as a Greek identity, but maybe not a Athenian Greek or a Spartan Greek. So it's kind of like saying a Oregonian America or a Californian America. Where California, we have to go northern, central, urban, rural, southern. So we can all say we're Californian, but we're going to have some means to parse what that is a little bit. Greeks did the same thing. So we also see a revival of trade. And really in the same time period, as those city-states start to develop, we start to see more economic activity. And from around the 800 BC period, trade and cultural contacts with the Eastern Med and other regions begin to revive, and this leads to a resurgence of wealth and cultural achievements for the Greeks. Greeks begin to colonize new areas, especially going into the Mediterranean Black Sea regions. So key colonies are established in places like Italy and Asia Minor. Smyrna is one in Asia Minor. So the Greek alphabet, I mentioned that there's a resurgence of intellectual pursuits, which also leads to the resurgence of a Greek alphabet. This is a new Greek alphabet. One of the most significant developments in this period is that alphabet, and they take it from, they adapt it from a Phoenician alphabet is the general consensus. I told you we would introduce you to my friend Homer. Here is Homer, 8th century BC, one of the most famous figures from this time, and he's traditionally credited with composing the epic poem, first the Iliad, then the Odyssey. Of course, like I said, there are other additions to it, and Mycenaean era would be their time period, but likely composed during the 8th century BC. Should say that they're taking these cultural memories, these ideas of cultural memories, and bringing them into their modern culture, and then adapting literature to suit their preferences. It is believed by many that, say, the events of the Iliad, that's the Greek-on-Greek violence in the city of Troy, and the kidnapping of Helen, at least represents something from this cultural memory, something that actually happened from the past. And a guy, archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, he's actually famous for finding the city of Troy. So we will be doing some studies on him. Now, it's interesting that the end of the city of Troy, the Hellenists are able to capture the city of Troy, and there are refugees who then leave Troy and they go somewhere else. Now, the Romans have picked up on this mythology, and in the Romans, we'll get to in the future, but I'll just mention, they have two mythologies about how they were established. One of those mythologies is that they are the descendants of the refugees from the city of Troy, which was defeated by the Hellenists, the Greeks. So they like this mythology of their antiquity is the city of Troy, this ancient city that goes way back and was a great and famous city that deserved recognition. So keep that in mind for a future. So say goodbye to Homer and say hello to Hesiod. So he's another key figure, and he is the contemporary of Homer who authored works like the Theogony and Works and Days. His writing provided insight into Greek mythology and the daily life and values of early Greek society. So this idea of the values is really important to our understanding of Greek culture. That is that they use these stories very specifically in how they pass on the Hellenistic culture. They use these stories to explain what it is to be a virtuous person. We even see this in the time of Alexander the Great. One of the things he did is he moved out to establish his dynasty outside of Greece and conquer new areas, is he brought in and contemporized and popularized Hellenistic virtues and Hellenistic culture. So we see that doing that all the way down in Egypt, and he would synchronize Hellenism with, say, Egyptian traditions and religion. But he would do so, and then that's essentially how he guarded his flank and his rear as he's moving on to capturing other places, is he just Hellenized them. And he taught them what virtue was to a Greek. So much like we perhaps tell stories about the founding of the United States of America, and we draw ideas of virtue and rightness from those stories, we draw virtue and righteousness and righteous living. We draw those things from our biblical studies. The Greeks do the same thing. Now, the Greeks do not read their mythology by this point like we read the Bible. We read the Bible like it's inspired, and we know it to be historically accurate. Okay? By this time period, sometime around here, Greeks developed a different hermeneutic, and they develop a allegorical hermeneutic, because they stopped thinking that some of the accounts of their gods were historically accurate. They still believed in those gods, and they took those stories to tell them how they got to be there today, but they did allegorize them and change the way they read them at some point here. By the way, it's later this allegorical style makes its way into the early church as well. All right, the rise of Sparta and Athens. This is going to be important for us later, because we're going to compare these two and consider, out of the two specifically, who won the Peloponnesian Wars. So that'll be an intriguing discussion time. But here we simply see the time period that they developed. Sparta developed into a militaristic and oligarchic society. It's famous for strict military training and social organization. They found the foundation of Spartan constitution is attributed to their leader, who we're going to talk about next time. But he lays the foundation for this very unique Greek society. They build their society around being a military organization. This is not a commune they're living in. It's a military organization. And you can compare that with that of Athens. So they begin about the same time frame. So its formation into a leading city-state, it establishes an early political institution. Its full democratic system, it comes along later. And by the way, the Romans will incorporate some of this into their republic. And the philosophers of Greece and Athens they're going to debate democracy and what that ought to look like and what that shouldn't look like. And those debates make it into the Roman Republic as well. So they also had, the first Olympics. It's recorded. The first recorded Olympics were held in 776 BC at Olympia, and it marks a cultural milestone as the games became a unifying event for all Greece, bringing together city-states in a peaceful competition. So this is one of the elements of Greek culture that helps them unify the idea of Greekness. They're going to maintain their identities as their own city-states, but they're going to be unified, at least within the philosophy of being Greek and having a Greek region. So, to summarize, between 1100 BC and 700 BC, Greece experienced significant transition from the collapse of Mycenaean civilization in the Dark Ages to the reemergence of a more complex society. The period saw a rise of influential city-states, the development of new cultural practices, and the emergence of key figures that, like we mentioned, you met Homer and Hesiod, the formation of the polis, early trade networks, and the creation of the Greek alphabet all laid the foundation for the classical age that followed. So I just wanted to add this. Now, you may have seen this already. So this chart lays out the part of the time frame that we're talking about, and perhaps the outline over here does a little bit better. So we're going from the fall of the Minoans in the 1400s, kind of time period of Exodus, down into, through this time period, we get down here. Now we start to see the Mycenaeans, the fall of the Mycenaeans in this kind of time period. So that fall of Mycenaeans takes place in 1100. By the time we get to 1050 or 1040, that's about when King Saul reigned, about 1000 BC. That'd be King David. Then we go down to the unified monarchy. So we can see a parallel society developing over here when we look at the biblical timeline. So this is a nice chart that can tell you, help you keep track of the kings' names and where they come about, and along with the historical books being represented on the side. All right, so I hope you can see those parallels and understand how these things are developing at similar times between the Greek culture changing and transitioning to that of biblical Israel adapting and changing as well. So with that, as always, if there's anything I can do for you, please let me know. I pray that these studies are continuing to bless you, continuing to help you understand broadly, as we study ancient history and classical history, how things fit together. We'll continue to do that as we move forward. And just pray that the Lord blesses you. Great day and week.